Okay, if you are here for the Gaza catastrophe briefing, our third part of our four-part series, you're in the right place. We'll just give it a moment for people to enter the room before we get started. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. Good morning and welcome to the third session of our four-part congressional briefing series, the Gaza Catastrophe, a briefing series for the 118th Congress. I'm Khalid El-Gindi, Director of the Middle East Institute's Program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli Affairs. And I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this series with Lara Friedman, President of the Foundation for Middle East Peace.
Thanks, Khalid. Today's session is International Law and Humanitarian Crisis. In this session, we're going to be examining humanitarian conditions in Gaza and issues of international law and accountability, including the ongoing genocide case before the International Court of Justice. To dig into these issues, we have with us three amazing experts we are very happy to have. Thank you. They're going to give us unique insights into the topic. First, we have Sherine Tadros. Sherine is Deputy Director of Advocacy and Head of the New York office at the UN for Amnesty International. She's an internationally acclaimed journalist. Before joining Amnesty in August 2016, she was a senior international correspondent and anchor for Sky News and Al Jazeera English, covering stories across the globe, based first in Europe and then in the Middle East. We also have with us Dr. Raz Segal. Segal. How do you say your name, Raz?
Segal. It's fine.
Okay, say Segal, Raz Segal. I always do the Hebrew pronunciation. Raz is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and an endowed professor in the study of modern genocide at Stockton University, where he also serves as director of the Masters of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And finally, we have Chris Gunness. Chris covered the 1988 democracy uprising for the BBC in what was then Burma. After a 23-year career at BBC, he joined the United Nations as Director of Strategic Communications and Advocacy in the Middle East, and he was Director of Communications and Advocacy for UNRWA from 2007 to 2020. He founded MAP, which stands for, it's Myanmar Accountability Project, in 2021, where he still is today. So you can read our panelists' full bios on the MEI and FMAP websites. Our colleagues will put links into the chat box, and you can also watch the chat box for links to their Twitter handles and articles and other resources relevant to today's discussion. And don't worry if you miss anything in the chat box, because we'll post all these materials on the webpage along with the video for this webinar.
So the format for this session, like all of our sessions, will be a moderated Q&A led by Lara and me. We'll put some basic questions to get things started, but we very much welcome audience questions as well. You can submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. You can submit them at any time during the webinar, and Lara and I will try to work them into the conversation as much as we can. Finally, please note that this webinar is being recorded. Also, if you have any technical problems or questions about the webinar, please put those in the chat box.
Great. So before we dig into our questions, or with our guests, I want to just do some level setting so that they don't have to, cover a ton of the background information in their answers. So I'm going to start off here by actually quoting directly from a Reuters report dated May 1st, 2024, just to give sort of the context. So from Reuters, the Gaza Strip is suffering an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe nearly 7 months since Israel launched a devastating offensive in response to the October 7th Hamas-led attacks that killed 1,200 people in Israel. More than 34,000 people have been confirmed killed in the Israeli offensive, which has laid waste to much of the Gaza Strip, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, with thousands more dead, feared, lost under rubble. An estimated 1.7 million people, more than 75% of Gaza's population, have been displaced, many of them forced to move repeatedly, according to the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA. Many have sought shelter in Rafah at the Egyptian border, where the threat of an Israeli assault has loomed large for months, stoking concerns of an even bigger humanitarian crisis. The displaced have crammed into overcrowded shelters in or near UNRWA facilities, such as schools, in makeshift tents, and in homes which have not been flattened. The conflict has damaged or destroyed roughly 62% of all homes in Gaza, or 290,820 housing units, according to a World Bank interim damage assessment published in March. It could take some 14 years to remove the vast amount of rubble, including unexploded ordnance, according to a senior officer at the UN Mine Action Service. The World Food Program says that 1.1 million people in Gaza are suffering catastrophic levels of hunger. The situation is particularly dire in the north. The deputy WFP head said on April 24th that more aid must be delivered to avert famine in northern Gaza, despite what he described as an uptick in deliveries and some progress in accessing that part of Gaza. The Gaza Health Ministry reported on April 25th that at least 28 children, most of them no older than 12 months, had died as a result of malnutrition and dehydration since February. And the World Health Organization, in a report covering the period up to April 20th, said that 16 to 25% of children aged from 6 to 59 months have acute malnutrition in northern Gaza, while 2 to 4% of them had severe acute malnutrition. And in southern Gaza, 3.3 to 7% of children have acute malnutrition. So that's all Gaza. Separate from that, we're also looking at the West Bank, and here I'm going to be quoting very briefly from a May 1st, 2024 report issued by the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, saying since 7 October, 474 Palestinians, including 116 children, have been killed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and about 5,000 were injured. The fatalities included 457 killed by Israeli forces, 10 by Israeli settlers, and 7 where it remains undetermined whether the perpetrators were Israeli forces or settlers. And over 70% of the fatalities took place during search and arrest and other operations by Israeli forces. So that is the background. Now we dive in.
Thanks, Lara. Chris, I'd like to start with you. We often hear people who are defending Israel's war on Gaza with things like, a ceasefire was in place on October 6th, and we can't go back to that. According to this narrative, the situation in Gaza and the West Bank was calm, and that life for Palestinians as well as Israelis was more or less normal in the period leading up to the attack. But in fact, history did not begin on October 7th. Can you give us some background and context on what the reality was on the ground before October 7th, not to in any way justify or excuse the horrific attacks carried out on that day, but just to set the record straight on the situation and the context in which Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza existed before this war. And as part of that, can you talk about Israel's previous rounds of military action in Gaza?
I think the context is very important. And let me begin by saying that when the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, talked about the context, saying that this attack didn't happen in a vacuum, he was accused of waging a blood libel, an anti-Semitic blood libel against Israel. And can I say, as you've said, I think that all historical events of this magnitude, of course, have a context. And I think it's really important to understand the conflict, so the context. So in terms of Gaza, there are 3 layers of context I would point to. First of all, the blockade, which has taken place since 2007. And we use this word blockade. And I think when you go to Gaza and you see the physical reality of the blockade, it really comes home. Imagine a foreign army comes to the town or the area where you live, builds a fence around it, a very substantial fence, and prevents people from going in and going out, prevents goods from going in and out, prevents exports from going out. Gaza is essentially an export economy. You import things, you make things out of them, and you export them at a profit. That all stopped in 2007 by and large. Secondly, the occupation, which dates back to 1967, And let us not forget that people in Gaza have been there. Many of them have been there since 67. And for them, there has been an ongoing occupation of both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And although Israel withdrew its settlements in August, September of 2005 under international law, where a state has effective control over air, sea, and land routes. International law determines that there is an occupation going on. And in any case, Gaza and the West Bank for the United Nations are one single occupied Palestinian territory in the singular. The third area of context I would point to is the dispossession that took place in 1948. Palestinians call it the Nakba. For others, for Israel, it's a war of independence. But nonetheless, 2/3 of Gaza are refugees or descendants of refugees from 1948. So for them, 1948 is a very real and living experience. They hear their grandparents talking about it. And just to be clear, both UNHCR, the other UN refugee agency, and UNRWA register the descendants of refugees as refugees where there is an unresolved political context, if you like. So where an Afghan refugee is born in a refugee camp administered by UNHCR in Pakistan, while they can't go home for whatever reason, the children born to those refugees, their parents, they are also registered. So those are the three layers of context, if you like. Can I say that, when I was in UNRWA, we prepared a report. You asked about the impact of this. We prepared a report called Gaza 2020, an unlivable place. And the UN predicted that by 2020, Gaza would be unlivable. And we're now 4 years on into unlivability for Gaza. Before the 7th of October, just some very basic statistics, 80% of Gaza were reliant on international aid. These are entrepreneurial people who want nothing more than, by and large, to work, to be educated, to get jobs. 45% unemployment in Gaza before the 7th of October. And just before I finish talking about the context, I would also like to say that I arrived in the Middle East in January 2006. And on the 30th of January 2006, there were elections in Palestine. And according to the Carter Center, these were the freest and fairest elections in the history of the Middle East. And by that, I assume they meant they included Israeli elections. And, the calculation had been that Hamas would not do well enough to form a government, that there'd effectively be a hung parliament. And I think that Israel and the Americans allowed these elections to go forward because I think in the back of their minds, they thought it might illustrate further the very real divisions in Palestinian political society. And in fact, quite the opposite happened. Hamas won an overwhelming landslide victory. And the response of the international community, particularly the Quartet, I think under considerable pressure from Israel, imposed the blockade. And of course, there were rockets firing out of Gaza. We can have a conversation about which came first, the chicken or the egg. But the fact is that in response to that election, Gaza was blockaded, and those in Hamas who came forward, the moderates in Hamas, and in those days we did talk about moderates in Hamas, who came forward and said, we want to take part in this election, which is part of the Oslo architecture. There was a huge debate within Hamas about whether they should be largely a terroristic organization, they should move towards democracy. In the end, the moderates and those who wanted to bring Hamas towards democracy, just as the PLO had moved towards and moved into the democratic mainstream, as it were, renounced terrorism, recognized Israel's right to exist. Hamas was actually moving in that direction in these elections in January 2006. And it's a matter of deep regret to some, and especially those in the United Nations who were trying to empower the moderates within Hamas, that never really came to fruition. I remember I would have people in the Tel Aviv Chamber of Commerce phoning me up saying, can you put us in touch with businessmen in Gaza? Because they wanted to trade. So, that is, I think, some pointers to the context. As I say, this is in no way intended to excuse what happened. It's an attempt to understand what happened. You ask about previous conflicts. My first conflict was in Gaza was the December 2007 into 2008, and then in 2014, broadly speaking. Those are frankly dwarfed compared with what is going now. In 2014, UN OCHA reported that 220 Palestinians had been killed. 551 of those were children, 299 were women, and we heard Lara quote the latest statistics for fatalities in the current round. Then back in 2014, OCHA estimated that nearly 173,000 children needed some form of psychosocial support. I would say that's much, much higher now. There were about 485,000 internally displaced people back in 2014. The figure is, nearer 2 million today. And in terms of damage, I mean, in Gaza City alone, in 2014, 500,000 homes suffered damage. 50,000 homes suffered some form of damage, and 25% of those were completely destroyed. That was in Gaza City alone. And what we also saw in 2014 was the sort of food production base of Gaza, which was largely the orchards, the orange orchards, the olive orchards in the north, completely destroyed either by bombardment or by armored tanks towards the end of the 2014 war. Over 220 factories were destroyed in the industrial zones. There were basically two in Gaza. Livestock were killed, bakeries destroyed. 10 out of the 26 hospitals were forced to close because of damage or complete destruction. And as I say, though, I mean, these are previous rounds. I think what's happening now is of a far greater magnitude. And very lastly, if I've got time, Khalid, there's one conflict I would like to talk about, and that's the 2018-2019 so-called Great March of Return, which certainly began peacefully when people in Gaza marched to the fence. And what happened in the end after a year is that 183 people, including 35 children, were killed, many by sniper fire, just a few hundred meters from the fence. The UN report that came after that said that very few of these actually posed a threat. There were, there were reports of Hamas people firing missiles and various things and shooting at the soldiers, but by and large, the vast majority were unarmed, peaceful demonstrators. Of those 183 people that were killed, 70 were killed with bullets directly to the neck. And the UN report said later that of the 6,000 plus injuries, 80% of those were by live ammunition. Often hunting rifles were actually used, but to the feet. So, there are hundreds and hundreds of children in particular, but others were rendered disabled as a result of that. So, while there is a debate about does the IDF ever directly target people, I would encourage people to look at that report, the UN inquiry into the 2018-2019 so-called Great March of Return. There I'll end. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great scene setter. And I'll just add, just in terms of the West Bank, I think it's worth noting that even before October 7th, 2023 in the West Bank was already on course to be the deadliest year for Palestinians in recent memory. So ceasefire has a lot of different meanings to different people there. Roz, I want to turn to you, and now we're going to hone in sort of on the current crisis. Can you take us back 7 months to the horrific Hamas-led attacks that took place on October 7th? Can you talk about those attacks and the hostage taking? What does international law say about those acts? And what does international law say about Israel's rights with respect to its declaration of war against Hamas using Article 51 of the UN Charter, which affirms member states' right to self-defense in response to an armed attack? What is Israel allowed and not allowed to do under Article 51?
Yeah, thank you so much, Khaled and Laura, and thanks for the question. I mean, since the first article I wrote after 7th of October, that Jewish Currents piece on 13th of October, and later on, I was very clear on my position, at least, in relation to the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October. I saw it, and I still do, of course, as a case of war crimes. There's also crimes against humanity, certainly in the sense of forced disappearances, which is the hostage taking, which is ongoing. Of course, I also described it as what it was, a case of mass murder of civilians. So that's all very clear in terms of crimes under international law. The thing is that when we now turn to Israel's response to those crimes, so does Israel have a right and actually an obligation to repel such an attack? Absolutely, right? Does it have a right then to go on a destructive assault that kills and wounds tens of thousands of people and leaves Gaza, as you described, Lara, absolutely destroyed in its majority? No. I want to also, of course, state the obvious. Genocide is not allowed under international law in any case, right? Even if actually a state is attacked with a genocidal crime, it's not allowed to respond by genocide, right? Genocide is outlawed in international law in any case. But it's worth mentioning that, the right to self-defense that you mentioned, Laura, does not apply in occupied territory, right? So because, as Chris mentioned, the Gaza Strip, also after Israel's withdrawal of its settlements, because it continues to control its borders, its air, its sea space, what goes in, what goes out, it remains, and there's a almost complete consensus on that in international law, that Gaza remains part of the occupied territory with the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. The right to self-defense simply does not apply in this case in international law. So no, Israel does not have a right to conduct the kind of attack it has been conducting in the last almost 7 months. And I want to maybe finish with one comment on, we should keep in mind what Israel's two declared aims of its attack on Gaza were and are. One was to destroy Hamas, right? The other was to return the hostages. It has failed to do both of them in 7 months, right? The only cases, in the overwhelming majority of cases of returning hostages was through a ceasefire. Israel has actually continuously refused good deals to return hostages, and we don't actually know now how many of the hostages in the hands of Hamas are alive. Just recently, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that with or without a deal, Israel will invade Rafah, right? Which basically sends a message to Hamas that there is no deal, right? So Israel continuously refuses actually deals to release hostages. And it hasn't, besides the case of the ceasefire, actually released hostages in the last 7 months. It also hasn't destroyed Hamas, which we know is probably an impossible task, right? So which brings us to the question, right? What is the aim of Israel's attack on Gaza, right? And it's especially important to ask that because, as I said, in international law, Israel doesn't have the right to do what it has been doing in Gaza in the last 7 months. And I'm sure we'll return to address this. What is actually Israel's aim in its attack on Gaza?
Thanks, Roz. Sherine, I'd like to turn to you next to help kind of round out this picture. On the same day of October 7th, as we all know, Israel launched its assault on Gaza. On that day, Amnesty International issued a statement in which it had urgently called on all parties to the conflict to abide by international law and make every effort to avoid further civilian bloodshed. Under international humanitarian law, all sides in a conflict have a clear obligation to protect the lives of civilians caught up in the hostilities. Barely 2 weeks into the Israeli assault, Amnesty again reported, in fact, Amnesty had already concluded that, quote, Israeli forces have shown a shocking disregard for civilian lives. Can you talk about Israel's conduct of this, of its war on Gaza since October 7th with respect to the lives of civilians, civilian infrastructure, and so forth? And how does it compare to Israel's conduct in previous assaults on Gaza over the past 16 or so years?
Sure, thanks, Khaled. I mean, you know as well as most, when it comes to global NGOs, much less Amnesty International, the idea of quick reactions is not something that we particularly excel on. So the fact that it took, barely 2 weeks for Amnesty to start to essentially raise the alarm, ring the bell, and say there are possible war crimes taking place here, just shows you the absolute ferocity, the lack of red lines, and just the intensity of the Israeli assault on Gaza. And Amnesty actually went even further a little bit later, saying that there has to be an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. And as you know, again, human rights organizations and Amnesty don't usually call for ceasefires, but such was the wanton destruction and commission of possible war crimes at that time, at that very early stage, that it took Amnesty International's board to say, yes, absolutely, we need to call this out, and we need to, call for an immediate ceasefire. And then I really want to just say one thing about this idea of international humanitarian law, because I think there's this misapprehension amongst the general public that, international law and the Geneva Conventions are there to sort of stop wars. War is bad. That's where it comes from. And so anything within the context of war is going to be against international law. But that's absolutely not the case. I mean, international law and, IHL, international humanitarian law, was created by states, and arguably with enough gray area within the law to absolve states of, blame and prosecution if the time comes after. So there is a lot of gray area in international law, but where it is absolutely clear is about the obligation on those conducting the war to limit civilian casualties and limit civilian infrastructural damage. We now have a situation where 34,000 people are dead in Gaza, 13,000 of those children. We're talking about destruction at a level we've never seen. I think this morning the UN said it will cost about $50 billion to repair Gaza. So, the idea that Israel is abiding by the sort of even the key principle of international law and trying to mitigate, the killing of civilians or lessen, the harm to them, doesn't, truly doesn't make sense. Either it's the worst army in the world doing its job, or it is not doing enough to stop, harm coming to civilians and to their property and, damage of their infrastructure. Amnesty in particular has logged various cases of what we have determined already to be unlawful attacks that have taken place by the Israeli army in Gaza. We've even gone so far as to locate the actual bombs that have been, used to do these unlawful attacks. US-made bombs, for example. We've even located the place in the factory in the US where these US-made bombs, were manufactured. We've given this information to the US government, and yet still we see that the United States continues to transfer arms and arm Israel against international law, which says that if you know that these kinds of weapons are going to be used to kill civilians, you have an obligation to look into it and to stop. We've also looked at, the killings, not just of civilians, and within that grouping, journalists. CPJ says that at least 97 journalists have been killed. Dozens and dozens of humanitarian aid workers have been killed by the Israeli army. Essentially, Israel is committing practices that are inconsistent with what you would see as, or what you would call as, the best practices of mitigating civilian harm. One thing that Israel continues to tell us and the world is that they're doing everything they can to try and protect civilians in Gaza, everything that's possible given the context. For example, they have these mass evacuation notices, and they did these mass evacuation notices recently in northern Gaza, right? So there they were trying to mitigate civilian harm, is what they say. However, when you look into it, they gave 1.1 million people less than 24 hours to leave their homes and move to the exact opposite side of the Gaza Strip, where they were also bombarding. This is not mitigating civilian harm. And I think that even an Israeli official said, it's actually quite impossible for them to adhere to this and to move into a safe place in the time that we gave them. We also have been looking at indiscriminate attacks by the Israeli forces, where in some cases they gave absolutely no warning. Between the 7th and the 12th of October, we logged various unlawful attacks. We looked into 5 particular attacks that led to the killing of over 125 civilians. And the recurring pattern that we see is that these attacks are indiscriminate, and they show a complete failure to distinguish between military and civilian targets, which is key in international law. To your last question quickly about comparing, I shudder to compare this war to others. I think, it's difficult to compare human suffering, but as someone who is in the previous Gaza wars, reporting from the territory itself, I don't think we've ever seen anything like this kind of intensity and this complete, disregard for the law as we're seeing and that we've seen in the last 7 months. I don't think we can compare this war to previous Gaza wars. I don't think we can compare it to any modern day war.
Thank you, Sherine. I want to stick with you for a second, drill down a little bit deeper on international law, on 3 what are sort of pillars of the Israeli political doctrine or military doctrine that have emerged in justifying what they're doing in Gaza. So I want you to talk about the argument about human shields, where Israel basically is disclaiming responsibility for civilian deaths, basically saying any civilians who die, it's Hamas's fault because they died because we are fighting against Hamas. These are legitimate targets. Second, the fact that Israel basically appears to be acting as if every structure in the Gaza Strip can be determined to be a legitimate military target. Here we're talking about hospitals, universities, schools, mosques, churches, based on the argument that Hamas is using them or Hamas is under them or Hamas elements are present. And third, the phenomenon that we've seen of Israeli military officials and pundits and soldiers on TikTok basically stating pretty explicitly that their aim is to destroy, erase Gaza, either leave it empty or turn it into Israeli settlements. I mean, you actually have this extraordinary set of statements that are out there which suggest that the intent simply is destruction, contra the arguments that are being made elsewhere. So can you talk about those three arguments that we hear all the time and how those fit into law, what warfare is allowed to be under international law?
Sure. Let me give you a specific example of a strike, right? October 10th, there was a strike in Gaza City on a 6-story building by Israeli forces. This strike killed 40 civilians, and the justification was, and this was also confirmed by Amnesty, that there was a Hamas member living in the building, in the 6-story building. Let's forget for a moment the very fact that that Hamas member happened not to be in the building when that strike happened and bringing down all 6 stories of the building. Let's put that aside, because I think that there's so much gaslighting that happens in this situation of, really focusing in on was there or was there not a fighter in this building, and who, how many people were standing around it and so on. Let's be super clear. Membership in a political group does not itself make an individual a military target. Even if the individual was a fighter, the presence of a fighter in a civilian building doesn't turn the entire building into a military objective. It doesn't turn all the civilians inside that building into military targets. It's simply not what IHL, International Humanitarian Law, says. What IHL says, again, is that forces, parties to the conflict, have to take all feasible precautions to minimize civilian harm. And if that means you call off a strike or you postpone a strike because you've made that calculation of how many civilians you're going to kill versus your military objective, then so be it. That's what you do. That is not what we're seeing in Gaza. Israeli forces are attacking indiscriminately and unlawfully. And that's a really important point. And I think that we get very sidetracked by all of these other arguments that are coming up about, yes, but there was this here and that there, but how many civilians did you kill? How much damage did you do to the infrastructure? These are questions that unfortunately seem to go by the wayside once we hear the word Hamas. When it comes to human shields, I think the context of Gaza is also very important. We're talking about literally a strip of land. That's why it's called the Gaza Strip. It's about 42 kilometers long. It is very thin. We're talking about one of the most densely populated places in the world. As Chris said in its intro, this is a political party, Hamas, and there are members of this political party that live amongst the population. So we have to, have that context when we're talking about human shields as well. I think that what has happened is that the many years that Israel has spent dehumanizing Palestinians in Gaza and essentially telling the world that everyone in Gaza, all 2.5 million residents, are all essentially Hamas terrorists or Palestinian armed groups and trying to destroy Israel, that has created a situation where we are not asking the right questions, and the world has accepted, and certainly parts of the world have accepted, and leaders have accepted this sort of wanton destruction of people's properties, people's livelihoods, and civilian lives, and that is, according to international law, not correct. And any sort of attempts to try and make it that way by presenting Gaza as some sort of free target because everyone in there is a terrorist is really down to this sort of policy of dehumanizing, and it's worked, because I'm not sure where else in the world this would have been allowed to continue, these kinds of violations that we're seeing and the deaths of innocent people on this scale.
Thanks, Sherine. Chris, I'd like to come back to you. I think, as most of us will remember, on October 9th, just 2 days after the assault began on Gaza, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said quite clearly, and I'm going to quote here, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed." Adding, quote, "We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly." Since then, Israel has tightly restricted the flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza to the point that we now see catastrophic levels of hunger across Gaza. According to Oxfam, Gaza is experiencing the fastest rate of starvation in history. It's very hard to imagine that this is accidental, that this is simply a consequence of unintentional consequence of war. Many, including Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Save the Children, World Food Program, have said clearly that Israel is using starvation as a weapon. Is that a fair conclusion to arrive at? And can you talk about how Israel has long used collective punishment against civilians in Gaza and the West Bank, and what that looks like on the ground in Gaza to deprive people, many of whom were already poor, as you clarified earlier, or reliant on humanitarian aid and are now living in an active war zone. So denying these people of the basic requirements to sustain life. You're muted, Chris.
I think it's important to begin by saying that you don't need a UN report on food security. You don't need an Oxfam report. Israeli politicians themselves, you quoted Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, but others have also said that no aid will go in. And what have you got today? You've got political groups, you've got settler groups actually at the fence with Gaza, preventing aid going in and saying quite publicly and on the record that Gaza should be starved. So, just like genocide itself, which, Raz has done a brilliant job at chronicling the statements of Israeli officials, but, as did the International Court of Justice, that a big part of the South African case about intentionality was just look at what the Israeli leadership itself has been saying, and that's just a question, frankly, of using Google. The other thing to say, as per my previous answer, there is a context here. So Doug Weiglas, who was a prime ministerial advisor, I believe it was to Ehud Olmert, famously said that Gaza should be put on a diet. There's, again, a rather famous, infamous document, the so-called Red Lines document, where Israel calculated how many calories the average person in Gaza needed, and then translated that into truckloads of aid. I mean, it was a shocking piece of research, but indeed that, it seems, or some people suggested, was for at a certain stage being contemplated by the state of Israel as the metric for allowing, for what it allowed in. To return to the present, I mean, Volker Turk, who is the most senior human rights official in the UN system, has said, and I quote, "There's a plausible case that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza." And certainly, if you look again at empirical information, Sigrid Kaag, who is the senior United Nations Humanitarian Reconstruction Coordinator, her office, she was charged by the Security Council rather, in December last year, and has been operational since January. Her job is to speed up and to streamline and to get more and more aid into Gaza. She's on the record as saying that she wanted to flood Gaza with aid, and she's also on record as saying that it's not just about what goes into Gaza, it's about what comes out of Gaza, exports, because Gaza is essentially an export economy. But if you look at those statistics, it's well below the bare minimum of 500 trucks a day, and that is a bare minimum calculated on what went in before the 7th of October, not what is needed now. As UN has quite rightly said, Gaza needs to be flooded with humanitarian aid. From an UNRWA perspective, UNRWA is desperately trying to get aid into the north of Gaza. There are over 300,000, about 300,000 people who are literally dying of starvation. 23 children, and this was a report from several weeks ago, 23 children have actually died of malnutrition. Now, as far as the facts now are concerned, in mid-March, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Mechanism, which is, that's how the world defines the most authoritative definition, or the definers of famine and starvation, the IPC, they said that almost, and this was back in March, this is mid-March, that almost 880,000 people in Gaza are suffering from acute food shortage. Around 680,000 people were affected by what it classified as catastrophic hunger, and more than half of the approximately 2.2 million people in Gaza are suffering from some degree of hunger. And they estimate that only 100,000 of people in Gaza did not need urgent humanitarian aid. And I think those figures have probably worsened considerably in the weeks since that report. As far as children in particular are concerned, there was a shocking UNICEF report, which I recommend to everybody, that found that in northern Gaza, UNICEF screenings found acute malnutrition among children had jumped. In the under fives, those are the cohort that they screened. Acute malnutrition had jumped from 13%, 13, to 25%, and I'd suggest it's much higher now. And 4.5% of the children that they had been screening in shelters suffered from severe wasting. And that's important because severe wasting is the most life-threatening form of malnutrition. That's how you know that a child is actually starving to death. Just a couple of vignettes, which I think really bring this issue of starvation to life. I heard Sigrid Kaag doing a briefing recently, and she's been going to Gaza for decades. And, she'd always said Gaza's a place which has always been quite rat infested, much more so, since the blockade in 2007. And she said, now you actually don't see rats in Gaza. And the reason you don't see rats in Gaza is because people are eating them, which I found a truly illustrative and utterly shocking thing to hear a senior UN official say. I'm phoning up colleagues quite regularly in Rafah in particular. Just last week, I was talking to a colleague and I said, what's that child? There was a child screaming in pain in the background. And I said, what on earth is that child? Are you okay? Are you okay to talk? And he said, no, that's just one of my children who's crying of hunger. And I just, I sort of stopped. I thought, wow. He said, yes, she goes to bed every night screaming like that. And if she gets any sleep, she wakes up the next morning screaming. And by the way, that colleague, interestingly, it's not necessarily about hunger. He had worked as a senior official in UNRWA, and he's been displaced, over 10 times. And he could be living in a flat, a very dilapidated flat in Rafah. And he said he's chosen not to because the Lavender system, this AI system, which the IDF is allegedly using as part of its prosecution of the war, he said that it's widely believed amongst Palestinians that if you're in an apartment block and someone piggybacks onto your mobile phone network and that person is on a list of terrorists or Hamas members that Lavender can identify, the chances are a £2,000 bomb will be dropped on your apartment block. So they are choosing to live, this family is choosing to live, sharing a tent for 12 people with another family, sharing a latrine tent for over 500 people. So they are choosing to live in these situations because to choose to live in an apartment block could cost your life. Anyway, I think those are some of the stories, the personal stories, that I really hope bring to life these issues of collective punishment and starvation as a weapon of war that's going on today in Gaza.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. Raz, I want to come back to you. We've mentioned a couple of times your article in Jewish Currents, and I'm not sure everyone who's listening knows about that. So on October 13th, 6 days after Hamas's attack on Israel, at which point Israel had killed more than 1,800 Palestinians, injured thousands more, and displaced more than 400,000 people in the Gaza Strip, you published a very powerful article in Jewish Currents in which you described the assault on Gaza as, among other things, a, quote, textbook case of genocide unfolding in front of our eyes. At that time, the use of the term genocide was highly controversial, and you received a lot of criticism. And now, more than 3 months later, the International Court of Justice has said that there is a plausible case of genocide in Gaza. And now, of course, this war has been 7 months long. And as we said in the introduction, we're talking about tens of thousands of people killed and maimed and injured and orphaned and displaced and millions displaced, a number of homes damaged or destroyed, and all of that increased exponentially. So can you take some time here to talk about first how you came to the conclusion, especially at such an early stage in the war, that it was genocide? And can you talk about what Israel's actions in the months since you wrote that article mean for your analysis and your conclusion? And also, can you talk about this idea of deconfliction and what it means, this idea that you can limit the risk to some groups that are not involved in fighting, especially humanitarian aid workers? Is that possible, particularly in light of what we saw with the killings of the World Central Kitchen workers, which brought the world's attention to the fact, as Sherine said, we've seen huge numbers of international aid workers killed over the past 7 months?
Yeah, well, I wrote this article on 13th of October, which is worthwhile to remember that's the first Israeli quote-unquote evacuation order. So I'll get to that in a minute. But what was very clear already then, and has only become more clear, of course, since then, was the clear, explicit, and unashamed intent to commit genocide that Israelis with command authority in international law, that is state leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers, right, have expressed immediately from the 7th of October. By 13th of October, we already had a lot of intent to commit genocide. Now, I'm not talking here, by the way, about the hundreds of documented cases in Israeli politics and media to incitement to genocide, which is also a crime under the Genocide Convention, right? A different crime. And Law for Palestine, by the way, has documented all of these on their website, the incitement, but also the dozens and dozens of intent to destroy in the language of the Genocide Convention. And by 13th of October, it was very clear that we're now seeing a state that has declared, right, clearly its intent to destroy, and that is already engaged now in dynamics of violence that are extremely destructive, including Israeli army spokesperson Daniel Hagari, who actually said explicitly outright, right, in an interview that Israel's goal, and this was 10th of October, if I'm not mistaken, right, is now to cause massive destruction and not focus on accuracy, right? These kinds of things. Of course, we also had Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant's total siege declaration that used dehumanizing language. So dehumanization is again another clear indication that we're in the realm of genocidal violence, so the human animals, but there are other mechanisms of dehumanization that Israel has used already before 13th of October, but also after 13th of October a lot, mostly Nazis, the portrayal of this weaponization of the Holocaust and the portrayal of Palestinians as Nazis. But on 13th of October, again, Israel's first evacuation order, and Sherine, you talked about basically the weaponization of international humanitarian law. And it's quite, I mean, we have a lot of reports and a lot of information on that right now. I mean, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories, Francesca Gunness, has published her report on genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza and described the weaponization of international humanitarian law. Forensic Architecture have published their report on the allegedly safe routes and safe evacuation areas. And what we know from the dynamics of violence, and we also know this, by the way, through testimonies of Palestinians, that is the text messages and voice messages that they've been sending out of Gaza since the 7th of October, right? That the safe routes specifically were bombed, the routes that people were fleeing on. The South, after the 30th of October, was bombed, as we heard, with the most powerful bombs that Israel had, US manufactured, right? The 2,000-ton bombs. And we know from Palestinians on the ground that the attacks were so intense on the South, in the South and on the safe routes, that some Palestinians actually fled to the South and then decided to return to the North, right? Because they thought that their chances of survival are better there. So this is very important in order to understand the crime of genocide, because it actually fits. The crime of genocide asks us for intent to destroy, and intent is very difficult to prove, except when it's expressed so clearly as in the Israeli case. And then we need one or more of 5 acts of genocide in the convention. And one of them, number 3, is deliberately inflicting conditions of life on the group calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, which this evacuation orders, this forcible displacement, basically, under conditions of siege, right? With no food, no water, no electricity, while also completely destroying the medical infrastructure of Gaza, right? And targeting really everything. And I'm not even talking now about all the vulnerable populations that we know about: pregnant women, the sick, children. Half of the population, right, are children, elderly. Even without putting all that aside, just the dynamics of violence that were already clear actually on the 13th of October and the expressions of intent meant that we're definitely, at the very least, we're in the clear risk of genocide. One last comment on that, just to say that as a scholar of Holocaust and genocide studies, as a Holocaust scholar, also as a Jew, right? I mean, why do we study, what is one of the goals of studying the Holocaust and studying genocide? Prevention, right? That's what we also teach our students, right? So that was one of the reasons for writing this article so early on, right? That there was clear risk of genocide, at the very least, risk of genocide. It had to be declared, it had to be put on the table clearly so that we will be in the realm of prevention. Of course, what happens since then has shown that we are definitely, as so many indications, including the International Court of Justice and other indications, show that we are definitely in the realm of genocide, and unfortunately prevention has not happened, quite the contrary in many ways.
Thanks, Roz. Chris, I want to come back to you. In an interview in February of this year, you described the situation in Gaza as, quote, the first genocide broadcast live. I don't know if you have anything that you want to add on that question of genocide. Please do so. But also I want to ask you to help us better understand this notion of deconfliction. And particularly after the World Central Kitchen case, when there was supposed to be improvements in how Israel operated with regard to humanitarian aid workers, especially, have we seen any kind of improvement, any notable improvement in that regard? or are we pretty much in the same realm with regard to deconfliction? And related to that, part of what we're seeing in response to this mass starvation is a U.S. initiative to build a floating pier off the coast of the Gaza Strip. And so what do we know about that, and is that something that is likely to alleviate this problem of mass starvation? Sorry, you're muted again, Chris.
Forgive me, sorry about that. On the question of the live broadcast, I'd be curious to know also what Sherine thinks about this, because she's moved from being a journalist to being a public advocate. In a way, I sort of did that too. Because, and Raz also, is this historically speaking the world's first televised genocide? I mean, we had Rwanda, I think it was post hoc, there was a lot of shocking coverage, maybe while it was going on, but mainly a lot of it was afterwards when people had access. And in Gaza, what you're getting now is it's being live streamed, it's being sort of reported on. Admittedly, foreign journalists are banned. And it's very interesting, actually, because most of the time, for example, when Fergal Keane, the great BBC correspondent, was banned from Zimbabwe, the BBC would always say, this report from Fergal Keane comes from South Africa because he's banned from neighbouring Zimbabwe. You don't get the BBC, by the way, saying this report from Lise Doucette or Jeremy Bowen or whoever coming from neighbouring Israel because they're banned from Palestine or Gaza or however you want to call it. So that's quite interesting, and it's interesting for me that the reaction that news is to some extent, I think, fueling the politics in a way which perhaps hasn't happened quite as much before. I think the fact, the Detroit primary, there was that the impact of that. So I think, there are interesting things happening that are perhaps different. But I can certainly say that the world will not be able to turn around at any level and say, we didn't know. I don't have more to add on genocide than, Raz is the expert and I, salute his work on it. Oh, Raz, please.
I'll just say we have to talk about Syria in this case as well, in terms of broadcasting and televising genocide. There's of course a lot to say about this, but Syria is definitely a case to mention in this regard. I do think that in the Gaza case we have much more of it, right? But Syria is definitely a case to mention in this.
And also the live streaming is producing very interesting and useful evidence for both the International Court, and if the ICC does start issuing indictments and arrest warrants, is because so much self-incrimination is going on social media now. And I think if people realize the extent to which they're supplying the world with evidence to be used against them, perhaps this live streaming wouldn't be quite so virulent. As far as the two questions you ask about deconfliction, just one interesting thing to say, and that is that as part of the relationship that UNRWA has, and indeed the whole of the UN has with the Israeli government authorities in both Gaza and the West Bank, the precise GPS coordinates of every single UNRWA facility is notified to the Israeli authorities. And they have this thing called coordination, where if UNRWA wants to move a convoy or a vehicle or whatever, it has to notify the Israeli authorities of the precise GPS coordinates of where it's going to go, the route along which it goes. It notifies the Israelis about the people in the vehicles, staff numbers, etc., are handed over. So, part of the sort of deconfliction from a UN perspective is to be utterly transparent with Israel and with COGAT, the part of the Israeli army that coordinates all of this aid with the international community. And so, as had World Central Kitchen, incidentally, that when the first vehicle was struck, the Israelis knew exactly where it was, who was in it, and which route it was driving along. They notified about the first strike. People who survived went into the vehicle behind. That was all notified. The second vehicle was struck. Again, the strike of that vehicle was notified. And then people got into the third vehicle, which was struck, and that was notified. So, as far as deconfliction procedures are concerned, the UN, I can certainly speak for UNRWA here, goes the extra mile in terms of notifying the Israeli authorities. So there really is no excuse why an army which has the most advanced surveillance equipment should be making these sorts of mistakes. And very finally, Khaled, on the port, when the port idea was first made public, President Biden suggested and said quite openly, I think, that this was a response to famine. And at the time, people like myself welcomed it because we all said this is, the land routes are the quickest and the cheapest, the most efficient, etc., the most cost effective. They must be maximized. And if you look at the graphs being produced by Sigrid Kaag's office, which I recommend you all do, we're still hovering best days about 300 to 350 trucks a day, which is well below the absolute bare minimum of 500, which UNRWA used to get in before the 7th of October. It needs to be much, much higher. But what has happened is the port was at a certain stage planned to go into the north of Gaza. So they build this big pontoon. The idea was to build it off the northern coast of Gaza, and there'd be a connecting pontoon or bridge or some kind of structure which would allow trucks to come and pick up the aid. Israel managed to make this, it's been turned into part of the Israeli response plan to the Rafah, the looming Rafah offensive, frankly. So instead of the aid going by sea into the north of Gaza, that's now being connected to the land much further south, and it's going directly into an area under direct Israeli military command. It can then be controlled. Do they go into Gaza? Do they turn left into the north through an Israeli checkpoint? And incidentally, UNRWA has been banned from doing any food distributions in the north since the 22nd of March, which is very much part of the Israeli attempt to destroy UNRWA, which we'll talk about just coming up. But the port now seems to be very much part of an attempt to control aid coming in, far from being a response to famine. It seems to be increasingly part of a military plan controlled by the Israelis. And indeed, if we do see a Rafah offensive, there's talk now about trying to move many of the 1.5 million people around Rafah to, and this was a city of 250,000 people prior to the 7th of October, to move vast numbers of those people away to a so-called safe area. And we've spoken on this meeting about what safe areas actually mean. So there's great concern, and the other area of great concern around this port is that there will be American soldiers, not quite boots on the ground, but boots on a floating pontoon not far from the beach of Gaza. There is talk increasingly of British soldiers, the British Army, driving the trucks that will take the aid from the floating pontoon to the shore. Now, all I would say about that is that it really does increase the chances that American and British servicemen will come in harm's way, could indeed be killed. But more to the point, it's the further militarization of humanitarian aid. It's already been politicized, now it's being militarized. And that, to me, is something which I think the ICJ will want to try and understand. I think those who are looking at this whole question of complicity in genocide and in war crimes will want to look at what's happened to this floating bridge. Because as I say, it began as a response to mass starvation, and increasingly it's becoming part of an Israeli military plan. And that should be a source of great concern to all of us, not least because it may lead to American and British servicemen being killed. And that would represent that would be a military and political escalation, which would be extremely unhelpful, to put it mildly, in the current context.
Thank you for all of that, Chris. All right, we're starting to get a little bit tight on time. Sherine, I'm coming back to you, and I'm actually going to combine the last two questions I wanted to ask because they're related. In February of this year, February 26th, Amnesty issued a statement saying not only has Israel created one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, which we've been talking about, but it is also displaying callous indifference to the fate of Gaza's population by creating conditions what the ICJ has said places them at imminent risk of genocide. Time and again, Israel has failed to take the bare minimum steps humanitarians have desperately pleaded for that are clearly within its power to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza. So I want you to, you're welcome to talk about the ICJ and the whole concept of genocide, But what I'm really interested in is this idea of bare minimum steps that Israel can take and legally should be taking, and what you see as the obligations of Israel under international law and of the international community under international law, given the situation on the ground in Gaza today. What are you asking people to do?
Right. I mean, first, what did the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the highest court, the highest judicial body of the UN, what did it say in January? I mean, in a nutshell, it is plausible that Israel is committing genocide. It then went on to say that Israel should be subject to these provisional measures. Essentially, provisional measures mean it's going to take us a lot of time, and history tells us probably years, to look into this case and to make a judgment, to make a decision. And therefore, we're going to issue these emergency measures that Israel must abide by so that, as we've clearly seen, there's a real issue here, and we've determined that we can try and stop these genocidal acts. So what did it tell Israel to do? Stop committing genocide in a nutshell, stop your troops from genocidal acts in Gaza, prevent and punish any public incitements to genocide, take measures, especially when it comes to the humanitarian situation, to improve the humanitarian situation, and report back to us in a month and tell us what you've been doing. Amnesty then looked into the first 3 weeks after the ICJ ruling, and that's when it concluded that not even the bare minimum steps. So what does that mean? Humanitarian access after 1 month was even worse than it was, insofar as Israel had failed to lift any restrictions. They're very simply access points that are going in and out of the Gaza Strip were continued to be closed. In fact, there were fewer crossings open, and the one crossing that was being used was open for less days the 3 weeks after the ICJ ruling than it was before the ICJ ruling. And then what was sort of like, as a numbers game, just completely egregious, is that before October 7th, there wasn't enough, trucks going into Gaza as it was. But it went down after the ICJ ruling from 146 trucks a day, to 105. So it went down by 1/3. So not only did the ICJ make this ruling and say to Israel, you must abide by these measures, but Israel not only didn't abide by them, but they made it so much worse. They made the humanitarian access worse. They, according to the humanitarian aid workers that we spoke to on the ground in Gaza, every single one of them either said that there'd been no difference since the ICJ made their ruling, or that it had become significantly worse for them. And they described sort of nitty-gritty things like Israel putting more restrictions on what was a dual-use item. So suddenly they were allowed to bring something in after the ICJ ruling. Oh no, that's not allowed to be brought in. And then there's the bigger stuff like reduction in number of trucks, reduction in number of access points, and access points that were open for a certain amount of hours. So this all shows you, just the complete disregard. I mean, not just disregard for what the ICJ said, but actually digging their heels in. And that led to, in March, the ICJ coming back and saying, well, where famine was a risk, it is now a reality in Gaza. And it then, had more provisional measures for Israel, which, to be honest, we're still not seeing the fruits of. And this, I think, leads very well to this question of, the relationship between Israel and the United States, and the obligations on Israel's allies. Because I think it's hugely embarrassing for the United States that its big ally, its big friend, Israel, is flouting international law in its dealings in Gaza, but then also just completely ignoring ICJ rulings. I mean, how can the United States sit there and talk about Russia's conduct in Ukraine or Venezuela or North Korea and expect it to be taken seriously when it is defending the indefensible, when it's protecting its ally Israel? And from where I sit, Lara, I cannot tell you how damaging this has been to the United States' credibility on the global stage. It is right now, for example, just trying to lead on a simple resolution on spyware. you should see the attacks it's getting from even, from even so-called friends from before, because you cannot talk from both sides of your mouth. You cannot, on the one hand, talk about the International Criminal Court and how it's, the importance and the independence of it, and Russia and Putin and all of this. And then, a few days ago go, well, I mean, I don't think that the ICJ or even actually the ICC should be weighing into this conflict. I mean, what? You cannot sit at the United Nations Security Council and vote in, adopt these resolutions, and then when finally there's a ceasefire resolution adopted, the United States ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield sat there and said, "Well, these are non-binding resolutions." Non-binding resolutions. When were they non-binding? When they were about Syria or about North Korea or about Russia? Or about China, Xinjiang? At what point, did you sacrifice your principles for your politics? And that's where it comes back to this relationship, because I do think that that the United States is a great friend to Israel, but is Israel being a great friend to the United States? Because it's really at this point just embarrassing. It's putting it in very difficult situations, and it's making it look a mockery on the global stage in sort of defending Israel's actions. And I'm not sure what the United States is getting from this relationship, apart from really this very damaging long-term, effect of how the United States can really be seen as a superpower when it looks like it's being bullied. I mean, is this a friendship or an abusive relationship? I think US lawmakers need to start asking that question.
Thanks, Sherine. That's a very sobering point. We have about 6 minutes left, and so I'm going to ask our two remaining panelists to be as brief as you can. Roz, I want to come back to you. Given your view that Israel is in fact committing a genocide against the Palestinians, how do you see the role of the ICJ and the ICC going forward, both in stopping the genocide and ensuring some measure of justice for the victims and some kind of accountability for Israeli violations of international law over the course of its war? And if you could add to that a discussion very briefly about what should the role of the international community be, particularly the main actors, the United States, Europe, and so forth.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we have to be clear that we're dealing here with a state. I mean, we're dealing here with a state that's conducting a genocidal assault in front of our eyes, that has defined all the Palestinians in Gaza as enemies, as the Israeli president said already on 10th of October, and repeated again and again, Amalek, Nazis, many Israeli leaders. Now we have the ICJ the ruling and the provisional measures, as Sherine, you described. One of the important things that come from the ICJ provisional ruling, I think, is the issue of complicity with genocide. Stopping Israel's assault now has to do with the fact that we all know that it can only continue because of the support that Israel has from the US, primarily from the US and from other allies in the West, but primarily from the US. And people have to understand, and that's, of course, part of the context of the encampment and the protests in the US today, right? That students are protesting the complicity of the US government and their universities in Israeli mass violence and Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. In some cases, the connections are so clear. For example, the weaponized robot dogs that Israel uses in Gaza are developed on the University of Pennsylvania campus, for example. But we have a lot of these. So the students are demanding to disclose this information and then to divest. And we need to understand that divestment here right now with the ICJ, there's not just a moral struggle, right? But it's also a legal dimension, because it leads us to the realm of complicity with genocide, which is a crime under the Genocide Convention, right? So I think that's one of the main implications that we should push forward, that continued support of Israel now. And we see this massive continued support, US support of Israel, as Sherine noted, right? Is not just a moral problem, but it's a legal problem in many ways according to US law, but it's a legal problem also in international law now with the ICJ ruling. I'll just say one more thing. I think that it's absolutely shameful, almost 7 months into Israel's genocidal assault, that we see nothing serious from the ICC, from the International criminal court. We see all these rumors around what's going on in the ICC, which tells us a lot about the impunity that Israel has enjoyed in the international system for decades, actually, of crude violations of international law. And it's absolutely urgent that they finally take a stand, a serious legal and moral stand, and issue the arrest warrants that they should issue, because the war crimes and the crimes against humanity, at the very least, are all so very clear and documented in front of our eyes.
Thank you, Raz. And Chris, you're going to get the last word. I'm going to ask you to be brief. And I'm going to ask you almost a philosophical question, which is, I want you to address the tension between the need to prepare for the day after and what that means in humanitarian terms, because there will be a quote unquote day after when at some point this ends, and the imperative to deal with the here and now and to make sure that when the day after comes, it's not as horrible as it might otherwise be. Can you address that?
I've done it again, forgive me. Certainly, I mean, the two things are related, right? I think addressing the here and now relates to what your vision is for the day and the years and the months or whatever afterwards. It seems very clear that, and that's not just from IDF statements and the statements of Israeli politicians that we've talked about now, it's the facts on the ground. And we've got this UNDP report today, which talks about the number of homes destroyed, the fact that it could take 80 years to rebuild Gaza. After the 2014 war, houses were rebuilt at the rate of about 900 a year. So, do the math. It's going to be a very, very long time. And again, relating this whole question of what's happening on the ground, intentionality, it's very clear from what Israeli officials are saying that what they're trying to do is make Gaza uninhabitable. Why else would you bomb all of the universities in Gaza? We all know that a university degree is prized, education is prized by Palestinians, so highly. And the very fact that every university has been destroyed and hundreds of university staff have been killed, that tells us something, I think, about what the day after strategy is all about. You might want to call it ethnic cleansing, as many have. The fact that Egypt is preparing for 200,000 plus people to come over in the Sinai, just in case the Philadelphia corridor is bombed, the southernmost corridor of Gaza is bombed. So yes, I mean, I think that there's a massive need to flood Gaza, to open up the crossings 24/7 and flood Gaza, as UN officials have said, immediately. I think thereafter there'll be a huge, and we've got Sigrid Kaag, whose job is to reconstruct Gaza. So that's a massive, massive task. But there is, as you say, there's the two issues of what you do now and what the vision is are absolutely related, because what the vision is, we're seeing that being implemented now on the ground. And I think that the plan from the Israelis is to make Gaza completely uninhabitable. And by the way, I think the port ultimately is going to be used to take people out of Gaza. And one very last word about UNRWA itself. The day of the ICJ provisional measures ruling, Israel had splashed on the front page of the New York Times a series of allegations about 12 UNRWA staff members. Cut to the week before last, the external report by the former French Foreign Minister, Catherine Colonna, found that Israel had produced, and said very publicly, Israel had produced no evidence to substantiate these claims. And we know from a leaked Israeli document from December that there's a three-phase plan of Israel to destroy UNRWA as part of this vision of what happens next in Gaza. And UNRWA absolutely is being written out of the picture. But nothing has been produced by the Israelis to substantiate these original claims. And it's very clear that the Israelis believe that by destroying UNRWA, you destroy the refugees as a political factor and their right of return. And of course, UNRWA is accused of promoting the right of return. Actually, what I say about the right of return is, ask the refugees. When you're trying to work out what the day after is, ask the people of Gaza, 2/3 of whom are refugees. And it's that, I think, that lies behind this Israeli attempt to destroy UNRWA. And there I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So we are officially out of time. On behalf of the Middle East Institute and the Foundation for Middle East Peace, I want to thank our amazing panel of experts, Sherine, Raz, and Chris, for this really important and rich discussion. Thanks to all of you who joined on this webinar, and especially those who submitted questions. We hope you got something out of it. I know I certainly learned a lot over the course of this session. We hope to see you again next Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for the fourth and final installment of our series. Next week, we'll be looking at what comes next, in which we'll be looking at the future of Palestinian politics and the Palestinian national movement. Our panelists will be Abdelhadi Al-Ijla from Varieties of Democracy Institute in Sweden, Noor Ode, who is a political and media commentator in the West Bank, and Moeen Rabbani from Jadaliya Journal. So tune in next week, and thank you again for joining us.